So my name is Lewis Bork. My title, or my paper for this session is Hidden Revolutions, Reexamining Transitions in the U.S. Southwest from an Anarchist and Network Perspective. So one of the things that attracted me to archaeology was these open-ended questions and the ability of our field to change and adapt. Yet our adaptations are not always substantive. Oftentimes they are simply fodder for critical reviews. Our flirtatious affair with unilinear evolution is one of them. If I were to walk around the essays, I'm sure that if I randomly asked someone what they thought about unilinear evolution, the response would be negative. We all know the reasons, the critiques that Western civilization is not in fact the pinnacle of social evolution, the dismay that we ever thought progressivism valid, thought that society moved from primitive to more complex. What I want to look at is the idea that we're still locked in on a unilinear evolutionary tract, and many of you know it as well. It's that dirty secret that we try not to talk about. But it's why most of us admit that bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states are really meaningless taxonomies. But it's also why we frequently fall back on those very same terms. World systems theory has been one of the few areas of thought that offers up an alternative. There we go. It's been one of the few areas of thought that offers up an alternative, and it takes into account the fluctuations in human behavior and large-scale temporal patterns. Yet it really, and really so much of what we use to replace our old theories of progressive movement towards statehood in the modern now is pretty much selling us a similar story. Whether it's multilinear or neo-evolution or modernization theory, these are really just rehashes and more complicated takes on progressivism and unilinear evolution. Now, obviously, Boas critiqued this type of approach a very long time ago, and most of us heartily agree with him. But it seems that it doesn't always follow through in our research. We know his critique is correct, but it seems to slip away as we begin our analysis. Now, this is not always the case, and there are many good researchers that are struggling hard against this trend. What anarchism can bring to this conversation, though, is an alternative way to examine what we think about when we discuss complexity, the pinnacle of the progressive march. Why, we should ask ourselves, when attempting to explain middle-range societies, groups that often fluctuate through time between vertical and horizontal political and social organizations, do we continue relying on theories that are essentially progressivist, relying on change from egalitarianism to hierarchy? These theories don't want to grapple with what we might actually call the regressivist nature of the long drive from egalitarian forms of organization to hierarchical ones. More importantly, we use theories formed around the ideas that hierarchy and complexity are synonymous when trying to explain people who are very clearly grappling to retain democratic worldviews in the face of more simplistic forms of hierarchical political organization. By questioning this progressivist bent, by looking elsewhere for theoretical buttressing, we can build an argument not based around our biased modern view of how the world works, but around how the people we study may have viewed the world. So this sort of is my take on, I guess, what we'd call the big archaeology of the U.S. Southwest. And the data I'm going to present here compresses information from cultural overviews on 3 large archaeological culture areas in the U.S. Southwest, to the ancestral Pueblo, the Mogollon, and the Hohokam. I use these overviews to create a semi-quantitative analysis by examining how sacred space is delineated from secular space, if at all. And within that separation are the foundations for control of access to ritual space. Within that control of access to ritual space is a foundation for controlling access and dissemination of ritual knowledge. And this follows along ideas of control of information and power within communities that Elizabeth Brandt has highlighted. Research into the archaeological past, the colonial period in the U.S. Southwest, and the contemporary present demonstrate that control of ritual knowledge through most of these regions is not simply about having some sort of control over the sacred lives of your neighbors. Many ritual knowledge holders leverage that sacred power into political and social power. Religious capital, in effect, becomes social capital. This is unsurprising given how heavily intertwined, even arguably inseparable at some points in time, the sacred and secular have been, and indeed are across most of the Southwest. Because of this enmeshed worldview, these fluctuations between hierarchical control over ritual knowledge and decentralized or egalitarian dispersal of ritual knowledge also signal changes in political power practices. We can envision control of ritual information as a dispersal of that knowledge through a community's social network. Those that are connected are included in the spread of ritual information and participate in its control. Those that are not are excluded. Ritual structures such as kivas, great kivas, ball courts, platform mounds, plazas, based on their level of openness to the community, allow us to examine exactly how controlled ritual knowledge was within varying societies. Basically, once control of your ideological knowledge leaves the household, someone gains more control of it than others. By examining the control of ritual space, we can see how control of power, and interestingly, the relative separation of sacred and secular spheres has fluctuated through time in the U.S. Southwest. Now, the control of ritual knowledge in these graphs that I'm about to show does not actually account for differences along gender lines, but hopefully someday we'll have data that's good enough to include that as well. And these are obviously broad regional syntheses, and we'll miss out on many local variations that don't fit. For some people, this is a horrible Jared Diamond-like atrocity. However, I actually think that regional syntheses like this, these broad syntheses, are actually great for exactly that reason. And they allow us to examine areas that don't fit and then interpret them against these broader trends. For ease of comparison, all regions are examined from their various archaic periods, starting at around 500 BC forward, and end prior to contact with the Spanish colonial regime. Further, the control of ritual space is translated into a semi-quantitative format for analysis, with 3 being most hierarchical and -3 being the most decentralized. Horizontal dashed lines demonstrate the mean level of centralization of organization across time in each archaeological culture region, excluding small regional developments. The broad changes through time in this figure are not shocking to anyone who is comfortable with the literature from the U.S. Southwest. It is clear that there are transitions between hierarchical and non-hierarchical control of power within different regions. Even more so, across regions, these periods of hierarchy are related to increasingly centralized control of ritual knowledge. Barbara Mills, while examining inalienable possessions in the ancestral Pueblo world, noted that these artifacts construct hierarchy by authenticating the ritual authority of groups and the relative rankings of those groups. She also argues that the destructions of these possessions is a purposeful act towards defeating the hierarchy with which they are associated. This is an important point that Barbara highlights because I think that often when we discuss transitions into hierarchical control of knowledge or self-aggrandizement, archaeologists treat this as an agentive process. It's self-aggrandizement. After all, it implies that someone is choosing to acquire power. Yet when we look at periods that show decentralized control of ritual, power, and social organization, it is often described as a social and political organization necessitated by environmental stressors instead of as deliberate choices made by large groups to reject hierarchy within their communities. Many of these decentralized reorganizations, I suspect, would benefit from being investigated from an agentive and resistance-oriented perspective at a grand scale. In so doing, we may find that these are not simply reorganizations, but reactionary adjustments to perceived societal ills resulting from centralized religious and thus political control. The Guyana and Salado examples demonstrated in this trend contextualized within a cultural context of tension between hierarchy and anarchy appear to be placed, and they're actually right down here on the bottom, and that's the Guyana one. And the Salado one. They actually appear to be contextualized within a cultural context of tension between hierarchy and anarchy, placed as though they're temporally situated as reactions to hierarchy. As archaeologists, we often get things right. The dramatic changes seen in periods like the pre-classic Hohokam dip into decentralization from approximately 8750 to 1050, which is this yellow period right there, has been placed within the broader temporal context and argued to be a reorganization and a reaction by Henry Wallace. Yet we often miss out on localized reactions to regional changes, as demonstrated by the Guyana phase of the ancestral Pueblo world, this group, right, one of these groups right down here. And its original interpretation is simply a backwater of people unaware of contemporary cultural changes. When Salado is positioned in its historical context as a hybrid emerging from interactions between northern ancestral Pueblo migrants and southern Hohokam locals, it suddenly takes on tantalizing hints of a decentralized religious movement that is rejecting rampant hierarchy in both of these regions. And you can see it's happening at about the same time that we're peaking up there. People are products of their times. In the American Southwest, repeatedly they appear to be actively choosing to reject hierarchical situations during periods of increased hierarchy. Higher resolution research in some areas is needed, of course, but a return to big ideas, in our case what might be best what Lexon called big archaeology, is probably most important to get at some of these dramatic periods of human reactions. While my idea of big archaeology may differ slightly from Lexon's, I share his and really Nassini and Sassaman's concerns from 20 years ago that Americanist archaeology needs to become comfortable once again, with the macro scale. On some level, because of the scattered, deteriorated, and biased against the common person nature of archaeological data, this is really one of the best ways to bring humanism back into our analyses. Dramatic changes do not occur as unthinking responses to environmental stress. Instead, they indicate mass decisions made by people at a grand scale. Interpreting changes in this manner allows us to approach an archaeology of everyone. Most importantly, in the U.S. Southwest, or at least the U.S. Southwest in historical context, breaks a lot of expectations within the directional realm of social evolution, neo-evolution, multilinear evolution. The pattern gets to the heart of why that is. Within the Southwest, complex social leveling mechanisms were in place. In some periods, those break down, but almost without fail, short-term or long-term, anti-hierarchical, decentralized social reactions occur. I think the sheer weight of the pattern we see through time and across regions in the Southwest indicates that this is not by chance. When comparing the vast tracts of the U.S. Southwest to those arid regions around the Mediterranean that move towards centralized power structures and eventually states, the U.S. Southwest is often perceived as a worldwide backwater, a region where this supposed progress towards complexity just did not happen. It's one of the reasons Yoffe's rule is so often recited here. What anarchist theory can bring to this global comparison is a critical reevaluation of what is civilized and what is complex. Decentralized political structures are dramatically more complex to construct and maintain than hierarchical ones, and yet repeatedly over millennia, that is just what appears to have happened across the northern Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts in the Colorado Plateau. There, social and political complexity actually won out, or at least was impacted far less than in other regions of the world. That should give us pause in our evaluation in both what it means to persist and, most importantly, in what success actually looks like. Viewed from this perspective, the Pit House to Pueblo transition, really the hierarchy that seems inevitably tied in with this transition, was almost invariably rejected by at least some portion, if not all, of the population. These rejections, I believe, are indications of a continuous rejection in the U.S. Southwest against hierarchical control, what I call the Pueblo to Pit House revolutions. Even in regions of the northern Southwest where aggregation and centralized control of social and political and religious power continued, it was heavily constricted through leveling mechanisms. In failure, these revolutions still seem to have succeeded. To finish, I want to recognize one likely critique of this position, the idea that this is just another naive form of romanticism. But the data is there, and I think the interpretive framework is there. We just need a slight change in perspective, which helps us to say that in the Southwest, unlike in much of the rest of the world, hierarchical power structures failed because of people, because of a continuous series of Pueblo to Pit House revolutions, our own Southwestern Springs. Thank you.